A kingdom kneels. The snow didn't care who ruled. It fell silently across the alpine village of Canossa in January 1077, blanketing the world in white. At its centre stood a castle, and before its gate knelt a man, barefoot, cloaked only in wool and shivering. He was not a peasant, nor a penitent monk. He was Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of a vast swath of medieval Europe. And behind the door he waited outside was Pope Gregory VII, a man who had excommunicated him just weeks earlier. This strange, frozen standoff wasn't just about faith. It was about power, the kind of power that crowns kings and unseats them just as easily. And this moment, in the dead of winter, was not the beginning of their feud. It was a climax, centuries in the making, where the spiritual sword of the Church clashed with the steel blade of the state. Henry had defied the Pope's authority by appointing his own bishops, a move that undercut the papacy's control over the Church's vast spiritual and economic networks. Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry, declaring him unfit to rule, not just in heaven's eyes, but in the eyes of his rebellious nobles. This wasn't just a religious sanction, it was a medieval death sentence. Desperate to reclaim his throne, Henry crossed the Alps in the middle of winter to beg forgiveness. For 3 days he stood outside the fortress of Canossa in sackcloth and snow. Finally, Gregory relented, but only to save face in the eyes of Christendom. That image of a king kneeling before a pope would haunt monarchs for generations. What's strange is how easily this moment gets simplified. History textbooks often portray it as a triumph of religion over politics, but many scholars now argue that it was also theatre. High-stakes political theatre meant to pacify rivals, assert dominance and buy time. Gregory needed to look like a spiritual victor. Henry needed to get back on his throne. In fact, some fringe historians suggest that the entire event may have been coordinated, an early example of soft diplomacy where both sides pretended at penance to save their public images. It's a stretch, but not impossible. After all, both Pope and Emperor walked away from Canossa with their core power still intact. What scholars still debate is whether this meeting truly changed the balance between church and crown, or merely delayed the inevitable. Did the Pope's moral authority win out that winter, or did Henry's icy humility mask a deeper political victory? Either way, it set a precedent. The Church could humble kings, but it could not rule them without risk. As the snow melted, the war between popes and monarchs would only intensify, moving from the frozen courtyards of castles to the burning hearts of cities, courts and cathedrals. Canossa was not a peace treaty, it was a warning. The sword and the keys, maps of medieval Europe, are more illusions than geography. The lines are messy, the borders fluid, and the power never quite where you'd expect it to be. You might think kings ruled their lands, absolutely, but for much of the Middle Ages, their authority was hemmed in by an invisible, yet very real force, the Church. The papacy held no armies, no fleets, no gold mines, yet it wielded two things no monarch could claim, the keys to heaven and the right to speak in God's name. This wasn't symbolic power. In an age when salvation was the only currency that truly mattered, a papal decree could make or break a ruler's legitimacy, and so kings and popes found themselves locked in a subtle, often silent war, not over theology, but control. Monarchs would often cloak their political goals in religious garb. When William the Conqueror sailed for England in 1066, he brought not just knights, but a papal banner, essentially God's blessing for an invasion. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095, it was not just to reclaim Jerusalem, but to consolidate the Church's influence over fractious European lords. These were not purely holy missions, they were chess moves. What's particularly telling is how often medieval monarchs styled themselves as divinely appointed. Their seals bore crosses, their coronations took place in cathedrals, and their titles, like Defender of the Faith or by the grace of God, were constant reminders that their thrones stood on sacred ground, but that divine endorsement came at a price. Popes, too, played the game. They weren't content to rule from Rome like distant priests. They appointed legates to courts, meddled in successions, and sometimes even raised armies. Pope Leo IX personally led troops into battle in 1053, an odd image, a man in robes at the head of a cavalry charge. He lost, but the message was clear. The church would not stay behind the altar. One curious footnote. In the early 1100s, the papacy briefly maintained its own spy network, reportedly using a guild of monks who passed messages coded in Gregorian chant. There's little solid proof, but it's a tantalizing image, the choir as courier. Scholars still debate whether the Church ever truly intended to rule Europe outright, or whether it simply sought to keep kings in check. Was the papacy a rival state, or a moral counterweight? What's clear is that Europe's medieval map was shaped as much by papal bulls as by royal swords. This balance of power, fragile, shifting, would collapse whenever either side pushed too far, and often it was over something seemingly small. Who got to appoint a bishop, who controlled a piece of land, who got to wear a certain crown. These were not petty disputes, they were pressure points in a system too tightly wound. As the 12th century dawned, the tensions would reach a breaking point. The war between throne and altar was about to turn openly hostile, and the first shot would be fired not on a battlefield, but in a bishop's chamber. Holy men, unholy politics, behind the thick stone walls of monasteries and cathedrals, not all was prayer and peace. The medieval church, for all its sermons on humility, was a vast machine of wealth, power, and political manoeuvring. Monks could be kingmakers, abbots managed estates larger than some lords, and bishops, many were more warlord than shepherd. While the faithful lit candles at shrines, high-ranking clerics sat in councils, whispered in royal ears, and plotted like seasoned diplomats. To the average peasant, a priest might seem like a humble man of God, but in Rome or Canterbury or Mainz, the church was an empire without borders, one whose influence seeped into every court and council chamber across Europe. Kings relied on clergy not just for spiritual guidance, but for administration. Many royal advisors were churchmen because they were among the few literate members of society. That meant they kept the records, read the treaties, managed the royal treasury, and often controlled royal propaganda. In effect, many monarchs found themselves relying on the very institution that might one day challenge their rule. One curious example lies in the career of Gerbert of Aurillac, a French monk who became Pope Sylvester II around the year 999. Before ascending to the papacy, he served as tutor and advisor to Emperor Otto III. He introduced advanced Arabic mathematics to the court and was rumoured, unfairly but famously, to have made a pact with the devil. Why? Because his scientific knowledge was so advanced, it seemed unnatural. In truth, he was a scholar caught between two worlds, one of faith, one of reason. What scholars still debate is whether church officials truly believed in their divine mission, or simply saw religion as a ladder to power. Was a bishop's cassock a spiritual uniform or political armour? For many it was both. Some clerics were genuinely devout. Others treated bishoprics like inherited estates, passing them to nephews or selling them to the highest bidder. This was the heart of the problem. Church offices had value, land, income, influence, and as long as kings controlled who received them, the papacy was never safe. The church might preach poverty, but it depended on a hierarchy tied to land and wealth, exactly the kind of system monarchs could manipulate. To counter this, reform movements began to emerge from within. The Cluniac reforms of the 10th and 11th centuries tried to wrest church control away from secular rulers, demanding that only the Pope, or God, could decide who wore the mitre, but theory clashed with reality, and in many places kings still treated bishop appointments like royal perks. There's an old proverb from the era, "He who pays the bishop gets the blessing," and many monarchs expected their gold to be returned tenfold in loyalty and influence. By the late 11th century, the lines were growing sharper. Monks who once prayed for kings were now calling them out. Popes were preparing bulls of excommunication like weapons. The uneasy alliance between throne and altar was fraying, and the next conflict would strike at the heart of both their powers. The investiture crisis, the real break, came over a ring and a staff. In theory, when a bishop was appointed, he received two sacred symbols from the Pope, a ring representing his spiritual marriage to the Church, and a staff symbolizing his pastoral authority. But for centuries, kings had taken it upon themselves to bestow those symbols too, effectively turning spiritual appointments into royal ones. This practice was known as lay investiture, and it was about to ignite a crisis that would nearly tear Christendom in two. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII issued the Dictatus Papae, a declaration that thundered across Europe like a lightning bolt. Among its boldest claims, only the Pope had the authority to appoint bishops. Kings and emperors had no right to invest them. It was not just a theological statement, it was a declaration of war. Henry IV, still the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, refused to back down. He continued appointing bishops in Germany and Italy as if nothing had changed. Gregory responded by excommunicating him, not once, but twice. That first dramatic standoff at Canossa, where Henry stood barefoot in the snow, was only a brief pause in a much longer feud. After being forgiven, Henry didn't forget. He eventually marched on Rome itself, drove Gregory into exile, and appointed an anti-pope, an act that fractured the Church's moral authority for decades. Civil war broke out in the empire between pro-papal and pro-imperial factions. Even families were split down the middle. What began as a question of who could give a ring and a staff became a crisis of legitimacy across Europe. One fascinating footnote: during the height of the conflict, a council of bishops loyal to Henry declared Pope Gregory a false monk. Their main complaint wasn't heresy, it was arrogance. They claimed he had overreached by trying to command emperors as if they were wayward prize. T.S. It's a rare moment in history when bishops publicly rebuked a pope, and it reflects just how blurred the lines of power had become. What scholars still debate is whether this conflict was really about religion at all. Some argue it was a smokescreen for a deeper territorial power grab, especially in Italy and Germany, where church lands were vast and lucrative. Others insist it was a genuine effort to purify the church from secular corruption. The truth may lie somewhere in between. By the time the Concordat of Worms was signed in 1122, a name less dramatic than the turmoil it ended, some balance was restored. The emperor retained the right to approve certain appointments, but only the pope could invest bishops with spiritual symbols. It was a compromise, but a fragile one, and it didn't erase the bitterness or suspicion that lingered. The investiture crisis had exposed a wound that could not be easily stitched. The idea that two powers, one divine, one earthly, could share authority over the same people was proving impossible to sustain. And soon that tension would explode again, this time with blood in a cathedral and a name that would echo through the ages. Murder in the Cathedral. On a cold December afternoon in 1170, the vaulted stone of Canterbury Cathedral echoed not with prayer, but with the clang of swords and the scream of a dying man. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, fell at the altar, slain not by brigands or raiders, but by 4 knights loyal to the king. His blood pooled on the sacred floor, His brains, hacked out with a sword, stained the walls of one of Christendom's most revered sites. The killers claimed they were acting in the name of King Henry II of England, though whether the king truly ordered the assassination remains one of history's bitter mysteries. What we know is this: the conflict between Becket and Henry had festered for years, and it was never just personal. It was about the age-old battle between royal power and church independence. Becket had once been Henry's friend, his drinking companion, and his trusted chancellor, a worldly man who wore fine robes and had little time for monastic austerity. But when Henry elevated him to archbishop in 1162, hoping to have a pliable ally in the church, something changed. Becket transformed. He adopted the garb of a humble priest, fasted, wore a hair shirt beneath his robes, and suddenly opposed the very king who had raised him. Their quarrel hinged on a crucial issue: whether clergy accused of crimes should be tried in royal courts or by the church's own, more lenient system. Henry saw a threat to his authority. Becket saw an assault on sacred independence. When Becket defied the king's legal reforms, Henry erupted. According to one chronicler, he shouted, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Whether rhetorical or sincere, the words unleashed a deadly chain of events. The four knights who killed Becket believed they were saving the crown. Instead, they damned themselves. Becket became a martyr overnight. Pilgrims travelled in Dihunt, roves to his shrine, weeping at the place of his death. Miracles were reported. The Pope canonized him in record time. And Henry, the king who had once tried to subdue the church, now found himself stripped to a woolen shirt, crawling through the streets of Canterbury, submitting to public penance as monks flogged him in symbolic atonement. The murder had backfired spectacularly. Rather than cowing the church, it elevated its defiance to sainthood. Becket's tomb became one of the most sacred destinations in medieval Europe, until Henry VIII, centuries later, would have it destroyed out of spite for what it represented. One lesser-known curiosity: the knights who killed Becket were excommunicated but eventually sent on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land as penance. They reportedly lived out their days in quiet repentance, far from the realm they thought they were serving. Scholars still debate Henry's true role in the killing. Did he give an indirect order? Was it a tragic misunderstanding? Or was it precisely the kind of deniable violence that powerful rulers have always used when faced with inconvenient rivals? The truth remains blurred by time and politics. But one fact is clear: the murder of Thomas Becket cemented the Church's claim to moral superiority. It exposed the dangerous line between royal ambition and spiritual authority, and reminded all who watched that even kings could be made to kneel, publicly and painfully. The feud was far from over. In fact, across the Channel, a new pope was rising, one who would take the power struggle even further, not with swords but with silence, law, and the threat of eternal damnation. The pope who excommunicated an empire. When Lotario de Conti became Pope Innocent III in 1198, he was just 37 years old, unusually young, uncommonly brilliant, and unapologetically ambitious. Where earlier popes had struggled to defend the Church's position, Innocent had no intention of defending anything. He meant to rule, not just spiritually, but politically, and for a time, he did exactly that. Under Innocent's reign, the papacy reached the zenith of its medieval power. He excommunicated kings, annulled royal marriages, declared crusades, and claimed the right to veto emperors. He wasn't bluffing, and the kings of Europe learned quickly that a quarrel with Innocent could cost more than a crown. It could mean national humiliation. His most dramatic confrontation came with Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV. Initially, Innocent had supported Otto's rise to the throne, hoping to install a friendly ruler. But when Otto invaded papal territory, Innocent turned on him with all the fury of heaven. In 1210, the Pope excommunicated Otto and encouraged German nobles to depose him. Within 2 years, Otto was out of power, but Innocent didn't stop there. He tangled with King John of England over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, a dispute that echoed the Becket affair, though this time the Pope would win outright. When John refused to accept Innocent's chosen candidate, the Pope placed all of England under interdict. That meant no weddings, no baptisms, no burials in consecrated ground. For 6 years, the kingdom fell into spiritual limbo. John eventually caved, kneeling before Innocent's legates and surrendering England as a vassal state to the papacy. Yes, for a brief moment in 1213, the English crown literally belonged to the Pope. No army was raised, no blood was shed. It was one of the greatest political victories in church history and one of the most forgotten. 10. There's an odd little detail often left out of popular histories. Innocent also excommunicated the entire Fourth Crusade after it was hijacked and redirected to sack Constantinople, an event he had never authorized. But even as he condemned it, he quietly welcomed the spoils and influence it brought to the Latin Church. A pope disavowing a holy war while benefiting from its outcome, history has rarely seen such contradictions so calmly embraced. What scholars still debate is whether Innocent's power was as total as it seemed. Did monarchs bend to him out of fear, faith, or political convenience? Was his dominance sustainable, or merely a brief illusion of papal supremacy during a time of divided kings and fragile alliances? One thing is certain, Innocent rewrote the rules. Before him, the Church had battled for influence. Under him, it acted like a sovereign power, issuing laws, levying tribute, and deciding who ruled where and when. He called himself the Vicar of Christ, but acted, at times, more like a medieval emperor in white robes. Innocent's reign cast a long shadow. Kings had seen what the papacy could become when it found the right man at the right moment, and many resolved never to let it happen again. As the 13th century progressed, monarchs began to organize, to codify their laws, and to strike back, not with defiance, but with bureaucracy, resistance, and eventually force. The tide was turning. The throne had knelt, but it would not kneel forever. Kings strike back. By the dawn of the 14th century, the age of trembling before the Pope was ending. Monarchs across Europe had watched Innocent III wield godly power like a sword, and they had no intention of letting another pontiff do the same. What followed was a slow, calculated counter-attack, not through battles, but through laws, taxes, and the clever narrowing of papal influence within royal borders. Nowhere was this more vividly played out than in France under the iron will of King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. He was not the most charismatic of rulers, but he was ruthless and methodical. Philip believed in strong kingship and national control, and that meant reducing the Church's grip on French affairs. His most infamous clash came with Pope Boniface VIII, a proud and uncompromising pontiff who still believed in the sweeping spiritual authority once held by Innocent. Their quarrel began with taxes. Philip wanted to tax French clergy to fund his war with England. Boniface, citing canon law, refused. The Pope issued a bull declaring that kings were subordinate to the Pope in all things, spiritual and temporal. Philip in turn accused Boniface of corruption, heresy, and even sorcery. Tensions rose. Then, in 1303, Philip sent armed men to the Italian town of Anagni, where Boniface was staying, and had him assaulted and briefly imprisoned. Though the Pope was released shortly after, the damage was irreversible. Boniface died within a month, humiliated, exhausted, broken. It was the symbolic death of papal supremacy over kings. The French crown went even further. Under Philip's influence, the papacy itself was moved to Avignon in 1309, just over the border into French-controlled territory. This period, known as the Avignon papacy, or more bluntly, the Babylonian captivity of the Church, lasted nearly 70 years. 7 popes, all French, ruled not from Rome, but under the shadow of the French monarchy. This strange episode is often downplayed in textbooks, yet it marked one of the most important reversals in medieval history. For decades, the Church appeared little more than a department of the French state. It still preached and prayed, but its political teeth had been pulled. A curious aside, during this time, papal documents and court proceedings began to include more bureaucratic French legal terminology than traditional Latin, a subtle sign of who was really in charge. Scholars still debate whether Philip's attack on Boniface was the result of strategic brilliance or dangerous overreach. Did he truly intend to break the papacy or merely defend his crown? What's certain is that he succeeded where earlier kings had failed. He humiliated a pope, relocated the papacy, and solidified royal power, all without a war. Elsewhere in Europe, similar trends took hold. In England, Edward I and later Edward III limited clerical privileges, reasserted royal courts over church trials, and taxed church lands with growing impunity. Even the Holy Roman Emperors, once pawns in papal hands, began reclaiming autonomy through shrewd alliances and local control. This wasn't the death of the Church's influence, but it was the end of its supremacy. The idea that the Pope could unmake a king now felt like a relic of another age. The war had shifted from visible confrontation to quiet attrition, and in that quiet, the balance of power was slowly, steadily rewired. Legacy of a silent war. By the time the dust of the 14th century settled, the Church no longer ruled from a throne of unquestioned authority. The kings had risen, not with a shout, but with a slow, grinding confidence. The old war between popes and monarchs hadn't ended with a single victory or loss. It faded into something far more enduring, a quiet rebalancing of power, one that would echo through the coming centuries in laws, revolutions, and the very idea of nationhood. The Avignon papacy eventually ended, but the damage was done. When the papacy returned to Rome in 1377, it stumbled into what is now known as the Western Schism, a period where multiple rival popes claimed legitimacy, each backed by different European powers. France had one pope, Rome had another. For nearly 40 years, Christendom was split down the middle. People didn't know who their spiritual leader truly was. The kings had not caused this schism, but they certainly benefited from it. A divided papacy was a weakened one. The Church, once a single, towering authority, now looked fractured, even human. Monarchs took note. So did ordinary believers. One strange consequence of this long papal monarchical rivalry was the birth of new national identities. As kings centralized their control and pushed back against the Pope, they began promoting the idea of sovereign states, France as France, England as England, not just Christian kingdoms under God's universal law. The very concept of a nation, distinct from the Church's umbrella, took shape in these struggles. The legacy filtered into law as well. In England, the Statute of Praemunire made it a crime to appeal to papal courts over the Crown's decisions. In France, royal parliaments began to override papal decrees. These weren't merely legal reforms, they were ideological ones. The king was no longer just God's steward, he was the law. One curious and often overlooked detail: during the later Middle Ages, it became common in royal coronations for monarchs to anoint themselves or be anointed by secular nobles, not just bishops. The symbolism was clear. The throne no longer waited for the altar's permission. Scholars still debate whether this long war ever truly ended. Some see it as a prelude to the Reformation and the rise of Protestant monarchs who rejected papal authority outright. Others argue it marked the beginning of secularism, the slow peeling back of religious dominance from public life. And yet, the scars remain. the language of politics is still tinged with echoes of divine right, moral authority, and sacred duty. Modern constitutions may be written in ink, but they grew from centuries written in parchment and blood. This hidden war, fought not with armies but with bulls, books, and ceremonies, redefined the architecture of Western power. It asked a question that still haunts political systems today: who gets to speak for the people, the sword or the sacred? The answer, as we've seen, was never simple, but in that long struggle between popes and kings, we caught our first glimpse of the modern world. Conclusion: for centuries, Europe's fate was shaped not by open conquest alone, but by the quieter, colder tension between two thrones, one of gold, the other of stone. The king ruled bodies, the pope ruled souls, but when their ambitions overlapped, neither could resist reaching for what the other held. From the snows of Canossa to the blood on Canterbury's altar, from the thunder of papal excommunications to the silken threats of royal law, this hidden war carved a deep channel through medieval history. It gave rise to martyrdoms and monarchies, exiles and empires. But more than anything, it left behind a world that no longer looked to one man in Rome for final authority. The lines between sacred and secular blurred, then hardened. Out of that tension grew the idea of the modern state, the limits of divine right, the power of resistance, and the long, uneasy dance between faith and governance. The war between popes and kings never needed a final battle. It won by reshaping the battlefield,